Greetings. I often say at the end of my videos that I look forward to the comments of others. And, if you watch a bunch of my videos, you're likely to hear that said at the end of most of them. And I really do mean it when I say it. I really do look forward to the comments of others because the comments section becomes an opportunity to trade notes and collectively improve our understanding of the subject that's under discussion. There are times when I'm gaining new insights from the comments on my videos, and I really do appreciate that. So in this video, I'd like to share a recent example of that. A little over a week ago, I received a comment on a video I made nearly 2 years ago titled Abba Bibbins' Identity, in which I put forth a case that the man known as Abba Bibbins was Edward Meredith Bibbins. Now, the relevant comment shared the author's understanding that, and the author of the comment, that shared his understanding that Bivens' name may have been W. Henry E. Bibins, and that he had written a book titled Marks of a Lost Race. Now, when I saw the title of the book in the comment, I had to do a double take, as I've actually come across that title before, but I never associated it with Bibbins. You see, back in 1952, there was an article which appeared in the journal Phylon, which was authored by Howard Brotz. And on page 327 of that issue, the article shares a long excerpt from an interview with a member of the Commandment Keepers. And that person claimed to have written a book titled Marks of a Lost Race. Unfortunately, I never thought to associate that with Bibbins because if you follow the quote's reference to the 6th footnote at the bottom of the page, one finds that that statement is attributed to a man named Robert Smith. So it never stood out that this person being called Robert Smith was actually Abba Bibbins. However, after receiving that aforementioned comment on my video, I went ahead and looked the book up on WorldCat, on the World Catalog, worldcat.org. And sure enough, the author is listed as W. Henry E. Bibins. Now, regarding that name, permit me to refer back to the Commandment Keepers attendance log from the 1940s, which is available at the Schomburg Center. And it also came up in my video on the identity of Abba Bibbins from nearly 2 years ago. Now, in that attendance log of the Commandment Keepers, not only was Edward Meredith Bibbins recorded as attending, but so too was one of his sons, William H. Bibins, or W.H. Bibins, if you reduce the first and middle name to their initials. Seeing that, I have to wonder if perhaps his son played a role in the writing or editing of that book. Whatever the case, seeing the book on WorldCat, I wanted to take a look at it. I wanted to see if I could, get my hands on a copy. And I saw that one copy is at the library of Northwestern University in Illinois. And I'm happy to report that I was able to browse the book. So in this video, I'd like to offer some preliminary comments on some of the content, as, it really does have relevance to One West history. Now, both myself and or WorldCat Malone may have more to say on this subject in the near future, but for now, I'd just like to quickly run through some of the points which stood out for me. Right? Now, first, regarding the author, W. Henry E. Bibins, as I just alluded to, I wonder if that might have been intended as a reference to both Bibbins and his son William H. The book does often use the first-person plural self-referentially. Now, as a disclaimer, that could just be a writing convention, as, there's lots of authors who, they write by themselves. It's just one author, yet he'll refer to himself in the first-person plural, right? And sometimes this is called the royal plural. But it is nonetheless possible that W. Henry refers to the son, William H. Bibins, while that E refers to the father, Edward Meredith Bibbins, the latter being, Abba Bibbins. But of course, there are other possibilities, such as maybe the son William writing the book by himself, or the senior Bibbins wrote it by himself but employed a pen name or an alias of sorts, right? But of course, these are all speculative. Nonetheless, it is interesting that Brotz attributed this to a person named Robert Smith. I have to wonder if perhaps the names got mixed up in his notes, or I would think more likely, maybe he did interview Bibbins, but Bibbins himself may have given a pseudonym, perhaps because he was wary or, somewhat skeptical about this person who was interviewing members of the Commandment Keepers, And if that's the case, then perhaps it could be said that he used an alias on 2 different occasions, right? But whatever case, getting to the book itself, Just want to run through some interesting points that I saw, and I don't intend any of this polemically. I'm just sharing stuff that I think is interesting and or relevant to One West history. And so to begin, on page 7, there's an interesting statement that the truth was never taught between the year 70 AD and the year 1914, with that latter year marking the beginning of the end of the Gentiles' age, or the Gentiles' dispensation. That aside, another thing I want to note is that the New Testament is referenced throughout this book. Now, this is a point of interest because, there are some people who dispute whether Bibbins taught from the New Testament. Now, we know that Bibbins referenced the New Testament in the one audio recording of his voice that's available online, and he also alluded to it in the letter he sent to Hatzad Harishon, which I showed in my video from nearly 2 years ago on Abba Bibbins' identity. In this book, the New Testament is referenced on almost every other page. So I think it's fair to conclude that Bibbins definitely taught from the New Testament. However, to be fair, it's also worth noting that this book was written while he was at the Commandment Keepers, so there may remain an open question as to how he perceived the New Testament, Whatever the case, moving on from that, on page 10, the book introduces the idea that some New Testament references to Gentiles may actually be referring to Israelites who profess to be Gentiles. So this concept, which is, found amongst many One-Westers, apparently goes back to Bibbins himself, perhaps as far back as the early 1950s. However, interestingly, shortly thereafter, the book states that Romans 10:9 is addressed to actual natural Gentiles. I wonder, what that might mean about Gentile salvation. The impression I got is that Bibbins may have been open to that, to natural Gentile salvation. But I do understand that maybe other One-Westers would take a different view. So, treat my impression as having a margin of error. By the way, also notice the reference to the Lord Joshua. It's worth noting that the book often refers to Jesus as Joshua, no doubt capturing an effort to put forth a more Hebrew name. And, therefore, this is a sort of precursor to the later One West practice of referring to Jesus as Yahushai, which is, Joshua in the Lashawan Kodash pronunciation. Now, those who are interested in the topic of Deuteronomy 28 may find particular interest in pages 14 to 21, which offer a 7-page long verse-by-verse breakdown of that chapter. And, of course, the discussion culminates with verse 68. On page 23, it is stated that none of the immediate descendants of Noah's 3 sons were quote-unquote white, but they nonetheless ran across a spectrum of skin tones. On page 25, the belief that quote-unquote white people are Edomites is put forth, and their skin tones are also attributed to leprosy. On an interesting side note relevant to the date of this book, Bibbins appeals to the book of Obadiah, but shows no awareness of the moon landing. The book doesn't have a year listed in any of its pages, not in the front of the book or anything like that, but I would assume that this is indeed the same book which was mentioned in that 1952 interview with Howard Brotz, and, rather than being a later revision or something like that. And Bibbins likewise calls European Jews Edomites and even makes a passing reference to them speaking Yiddish rather than Hebrew. However, let me point out that there are no clear indications of Lashawan Kodash in the book. While I did not see any attempt to break down the tribes, Bibbins does describe Judah as, quote, the blackest of all his brothers, end quote. And he references Jeremiah 14:2 amongst various other verses in support of that position. Interestingly, Bibbins invokes the speckled bird in Jeremiah to argue that the Israelites run across a spectrum of skin tones, black, brown, yellow, etc. And those who are familiar with One-Westers may know that this interpretation is put forth to this day. Towards the end of the book, there's a discussion on the feast days, which I personally found particularly interesting. Bibbins recognizes Rosh Hashanah as, which in the fall as the new year, which differs from, the approach which One-Westers currently take. Beyond that, he also recognizes the rabbinic festival of Shemini Atzeret. He alludes to it ending the yearly cycle of Torah readings, which seems to show that he recognized the parashot, the rabbinic division of weekly Torah portions or weekly Torah readings. I thought that was interesting. Now, when discussing Purim and Passover, one gets the impression that Bibbins might have taken the position that they fell on fixed dates on the solar calendar. Now, I know some people might be quick to attribute that to him being in an early stage of familiarity with the subject, but I could be wrong about this, but I've heard that GOCC might be holding to a solar calendar. So, if that's true, maybe members of GOCC might find that interesting. If that statement about GOCC holding to a solar calendar is mistaken, I apologize, but whatever the case. But getting back to Bibbins, so too when he discusses the first month and the seventh month, one again gets the impression that he had them aligning with months on the solar calendar, on the Gregorian calendar, rather than just sort of partially overlapping with such months. I thought that was interesting as well. But that aside, perhaps the most interesting detail comes on the back cover of the book, where there's an ink stamp which reads, "Property of the Israel Tanakh School at 1 West 125th Street in New York City." I would be reluctant to say that that means that 1 West existed when the book was written. Rather, I would propose that the book stayed amongst Bibbins and his students on into the late 60s and early 70s. Now, how this particular book wound up at Northwestern University's library is an interesting question, which I do not know the answer to at this time, but I hope to look into it because I think that there might be an interesting story there as well. We'll see. I'll certainly share it if I find out anything. On that note, I'll close here, but I want to close with a couple of acknowledgments. First, I want to thank the gentleman who left that comment on my video a little over a week ago, as it honestly provided a valuable piece to add to our evolving understanding of this puzzle, which is, 1 West history, or the early history of 1 West and Abba Bibbins, etc. I also must confess that my attempts to research 1 West history in general, and Abba Bibbins in particular, has benefited tremendously from the work and research of Sam Kestenbaum. I definitely recommend his piece titled "I'm an Israelite, Kendrick Lamar's Spiritual Search, Hebrew Israelite Religion, and the Politics of a Celebrity Encounter," which is the 16th chapter in the Routledge compilation titled "Kendrick Lamar and the Making of Black Meaning." For anyone who's interested in researching some of these topics, I think you'd find particularly interesting the plethora of endnotes appended to Mr. Kestenbaum's article. With that, I hope others who are interested in piecing together 1 West history found this interesting. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. And again, I really do mean that this video is an example of how the conversation can benefit from the comments of others. On that note, God bless.